the next unit, which is nationalism and sectionalism. The word sectionalism should sound familiar to us because this is one of the great challenges we discussed in the previous unit, right, when we were talking about the challenges the new nation faced. Sectionalism was one of the major ones. And as the 1800s progress, as the 19th century progresses, we're going to see that sectionalism becomes more and more of a serious, not even just problem at this point, but becomes more and more of a threat to the existence of the country entirely. And so something that we should keep in mind for this unit, the essential question of this unit, is how did political, economic, and technological changes promote sectionalism? Right? So we're going to kind of walk through each of those three different categories throughout the course of this unit and see how each one of those promotes this idea of sectionalism. Again, sectionalism is the idea that a person favors or is more concerned about their section or state than they are about the whole national country and the national interest. Right, these two quotes are kind of typical or good examples of the two different perspectives on the issue of sectionalism and nationalism. So the first quote here by a man named Daniel Webster, who was a senator from New England, I believe Massachusetts. He was also a great orator, so he was really known for the famous speeches he gave, and he was a really good debater. And he eventually becomes the Secretary of State to more than one president. And he's at a kind of a banquet or a dinner, he stood up and gave a toast, and the toast was liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable, right? Pretty much meaning that you can't have liberty or freedom without the union, without the collection of the states, right? And so this is really a nationalist idea, right? Promoting the country above a section. As the story goes, in that same event that they were at, John C. Calhoun, who was a senator from South Carolina, and also eventually a vice president under Andrew Jackson, came with this next toast. And he said, the union next to our liberty most dear, right? So he's not trying to discredit the union, but he's not putting it on the same level as freedom or liberty. All right, and this is really highlighting the idea that above the collection of these states together needs to be our liberty. And if our liberty isn't being properly protected, the union is not as important, right? And so those two quotes really highlight well the issue of sectionalism that's going to develop throughout the 19th century. And so one thing that really leads to further an increase in sectional feelings is industrialization. Right, and industrialization, and the Industrial Revolution, which is part of that, right, is this decades-long process which transformed the United States from an agrarian or rural to an industrial or urban society. Right, so it's the growing reliance on factories and mechanical tools for economic production. Right, less reliance on farming, more mass production. Right, producing things in large quantities instead of one at a time. And the invention or advent of interchangeable parts, right? That, if something on a tool or whatnot breaks, you don't have to replace the entire thing, but just that one piece. And that leads to kind of easier production of things because it's just pieces that fit together, right? Instead of having to build one thing in its entirety. And so all these things contribute to the Industrial Revolution. But the effects of this industrialization, and we'll get to that in a minute actually, but one effect of this, or not one effect, one cause of this industrialization is the political moment that the country's experiencing at this time. So in the previous unit, we talked about this War of 1812, which started because the British Navy was kidnapping American sailors and American merchants and forcing them into their navy in a policy called impressment. And so to stop that initially, what President Jefferson tries to do is he passes an embargo or promotes the passage of an embargo act. He signs it into law in 1807. And this embargo act actually bans the importation of British goods. Right? So he's trying to hurt the British economy by not letting British goods into the country. In reality, this actually does more damage to, or affects Americans more because they need these supplies and now they can't have them. So in the short term, it's actually a very unpopular law that's passed and people don't like Jefferson for it. But in reality, it does help to spur or promote domestic production, meaning production of goods in America. So the origins of American manufacturing actually are a result of the Embargo Act of 1807, and they accelerate them with the War of 1812. Once we go to war with Great Britain, there's a real need for things to be produced in America, both for the war effort and for consumers. And so these two political moments contribute to industrialization. But industrialization does not affect the entire country uniformly. Different parts of the country, different sections of the country are affected differently. So, for example, in New England, which previously had depended heavily on foreign trade, right? You have ports like Boston and other ports, New York, for example, too. Though that's not technically New England. These cities relied on foreign trade and merchants, right? And now that that's kind of paused or decreased during the War of 1812, people in New England begin to focus their attention on manufacturing the goods in this in the country itself, right? And so that promotes that. The kind of famous example of this is in Lowell, Massachusetts, which becomes the model factory town that several other towns in New England and throughout the country are going to adopt as industrialization increases. And essentially what this factory town is that instead of having things made or assembled in separate places, so for example with textile industry or clothing, instead of weaving the cloth in one place, dyeing it in another, and then sewing it and finishing it in a third place, all this was brought into one location, into one factory, right, to make it more efficient and more cost effective. And instead, the people came to the factory instead of doing it in their own homes. Not only that, though, a lot of these people, and at this time, the Lowell system was comprised of almost entirely young single women. They would leave their homes and they would come to these towns and they would live in like dorm-style housing, and they would work during the day and they would live together at night. And so this is what becomes known as the Lowell system. These workers come to the factory complex to live there and work there. And this is really the very beginnings of industrialization in America, or these factory towns in New England. Right here is showing you kind of how everything's concentrated now into one building. All the different levels of the factory have different purposes, and different elements of the process are made on each level. And it's water powered. So this is when we have heavy machinery being used, but it's before the era of electricity, right? And so how do you get power? You have to find other sources. And the first main source was water power, hydropower. Over time, that will be replaced by coal and steam. But like I mentioned, right, industrialization does not affect the country in a uniform way. So the northern states, right, they industrialize because they can't rely on agriculture, right? The big money is not in cash crops in the north because of the climate, and the geography prevents the growth of these large plantations. And like we mentioned before, right, foreign trade is affected because of wars and politics. And so they begin industrializing the northern states. New England, parts of New York begin to industrialize, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. The southern states, though, have a completely different climate, and they continue to rely on large-scale agriculture, these giant plantations, and the growing of crops, cash crops like tobacco and cotton. What kind of further fuels this, though, is as industrialization occurs in the north, and there's more and more, mass production, more and more, things like clothing are being produced, there's a greater need for the raw materials being grown in the south. So in the textile industry in the north, there's a great need for cotton. And so what does that make the South do? People want to make money, so they begin growing more and more cotton. Unfortunately, what this does, though, is that it actually increases the reliance on enslaved Africans for labor. Right? More Africans are imported, often illegally, and then just because of natural growth, enslaved people marrying and having children. And so the nation is becoming more and more divided. And even from the early 1800s, politicians start to realize this, right? And they realize that this action is needed to unite the nation. All right, and so what they do is some politicians in Congress propose what's called the American system, which was supported by the president at the time, President James Madison. And it's organized by two people, Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, which is the kind of the leader of the House of Representatives. And his nickname is the Great Compromiser, and that name's going to come back when we talk more about him for future things. But he's known for trying to compromise between the North and the South to keep the country together. John C. Calhoun, who we mentioned with that quote earlier on, he is a future vice president and a senator at this time. And Calhoun's interesting because as time goes on, he gets more and more focused on his section. But at this time, earlier on in his career, he is trying to help the nation as a whole. And so what this American system does is it does three things. It improves and develops transportation systems, it establishes a protective tariff, and it recreates the national bank that had been allowed to expire. that was created by Alexander Hamilton. So internal improvements like this, the national road, which is financed by the federal government, which to us seems normal. The federal government gives lots of money for things today, like the interstate highway system. But at the time, that was unheard of. The federal government, it was not believed that was its constitutional role to provide, transportation. That was believed to have been left up to the states. But by 1838, the national road is financed partly by the federal government, and it connects Maryland to Illinois. So it's bringing us out west now, encouraging western migration. We also have the Erie Canal, which was financed by New York State itself. But the Erie Canal, which connects Lake Erie, which borders the Midwestern states of like Ohio and Michigan, to the Hudson River, which then brings you down to New York City and the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a way of connecting New York City as the major trading port of the country with the hinterlands, right, where things are being grown and materials are being made right out in the Midwest. Now can get to New York City, the center of trade, much more easily and much more efficiently. And so these are all important improvements that are meant to kind of connect different sections of the country together. And ultimately, this and other things will help kind of unite the northern and western sections of the country together more than it would with the south. But here's a map here just showing you some of the canals that were built during this time period to help try to unite and connect the different parts of the country. So we have the Erie Canal up here and throughout New York State, right? And there's also a canal that connects all the way down to Kentucky, right? So you really can get, through boat now, you can get from Kentucky all the way through Ohio, across to New York City, and out to wherever it needs to go, right? And there's other canals as well that connects to, say, Philadelphia, Washington, other major cities. So it's an important way to bring the country together and promote trade. There's also, in this time, part of the American system, this protective tariff that I mentioned. And a tariff is a tax on imported goods, right? So it's a way to make American-made manufactured materials more competitive with foreign-made stuff, right? We all know today that almost everything we own is made in China because things can be made so much more cheaply in China. And so we buy that because it's cheaper for us then. If the United States was to pass a tariff and make that as expensive or more expensive than American-made products, we would start buying American products again, right? So that's the mentality behind these tariffs. They're supported by the Northerners because the Northerners are the ones who are making the products, right? The Northern manufacturers. So they're going to want government help to make their business more competitive. However, Westerners and Southerners who are used to buying the cheaper goods from Europe or elsewhere, the cost of their goods are now going up because in order to make American products more competitive, you're not decreasing the price of those American products, you're actually increasing the price of foreign products. So really, the consumers are losing out on this, right? Because they're not getting the cheapest possible price that they can. At this time also, a second Bank of the United States, which was not really a popular move at this time, creating a national bank, was chartered in 1816 for 20 years. So there's the first national bank, this is the second national bank. It promotes a uniform national currency, which, believe it or not, was not necessarily common at the beginning part of our country. And that kind of helps unite the different sections together, increases and facilitates trade and all those things. All right, so these are some efforts that are initially made to help improve tensions between the sections. But as we can see from this as well, there are several things promoting the separation of the different sections, north and south predominantly. And we're going to continue talking about that in the next lecture.